This week we're going to talk about a very important consideration in human services practice, which is the extent to which values and ethics play a role in our work. It is often in our internship experiences that we first encounter ethical dilemmas. And our internship is a time to internalize the profession's standards and ethics, to learn about our legal obligations as practitioners, and to clarify our own values. So your internship is going to be the beginning of a lifelong journey in developing ethical competence. So these are the learning objectives for this week. We want you to be able to differentiate between ethics, legal obligations, standards of care, and professional values, and to have some criteria for how you make ethical decisions. And then we're going to talk about different case scenarios and how you might apply ethical principles to those situations, which will be very typical in your internship sites. Let's start first with some definitions. Before we look at the issue of ethical competence, it's important to understand what some of the concepts are related to ethics. Morality is a system of beliefs about what is right and wrong, and what is good behavior and what is bad behavior. This morality is often dictated by an authority outside the individual, such as society or religion. And morality comes from the Latin word mos, M-O-S, meaning custom. Legal obligations are the parts of our work that are covered by law or statute. Things such as client confidentiality, duty to warn, responsibility to report abuse and neglect. Laws are often more black and white and right and wrong, but we can often see when we get into these laws that there are still shades of gray that lead to ethical dilemmas. Standards of care are the services or interventions that are based on sound theoretical principles applied appropriately and reliably to the population being served in the service setting. They are standards that are generally agreed upon to be good practice by our profession. Values are fundamental beliefs, what we value and consider most important. We have personal values, which are our beliefs that what is good or desirable, and they can be based on knowledge, morals, and culture, but they're individualized to our particular situations. And we often learn our values at a young age, and we're not always aware of them. Professional values are beliefs or characteristics that are valued by the profession, such as respect, client self-determination, empathy, genuineness, human dignity, not being non-judgmental. And so kind of all these things make up ethics. Ethics are values, morality, laws, and standards in action. The rules or standards governing the conduct of a person or the member of a profession is what we consider ethics. And it comes from the Greek word ethos, which means character. All professions in the human services or helping professions have codes of ethics or ethical standards that they have developed to monitor themselves and their behavior. Ethics are often related to the shades of gray, and sometimes we look at things as being more right or less wrong as opposed to strictly right or wrong. Many things are relevant to the context or the people involved, and following the law may be part of the process, but not all of the process. So there's many different types of ethical dilemmas that we are going to encounter in the workplace or the internship site. And Reamer defines ethical dilemma as a situation where professional duties and obligations rooted in core values clash. In this situation, the professional must decide which values take precedence, and this requires reflection, examination, awareness, and conscious decision-making, where the choice is not between what believed to be right and what believed to be wrong, but sometimes between competing rights. So let me just talk a little bit about these different types of dilemmas. Conflicts in beliefs and morals might be related to your beliefs and morals about abortion, birth control, right to die. Client confidentiality, privacy, and informed consent could be related to the HIPAA standards, to our referral process, and the way that we bring clients into an agency and orient them to the helping services that are available. Professional competency is related, some examples could be when you have staff shortages and so the client is not getting the full services that they deserve, or if you have unsupervised students and volunteers who are not getting good supervision, or if you practice outside of what you've been trained to practice. Respect for client autonomy, this kind of ethical dilemma might involve supporting a decision that a client makes that you don't agree with. An ethical dilemma related to challenges in the helping system might be referring a client to an agency where you feel the client will not really get the help they need, or just knowing that there's a lack of resources to help the client and how you handle that. Conflict of interest is where you, for example, you refer a client to an agency where your husband is the therapist, or if you have a vested interest in the services providing, maybe a monetary interest. Professional boundaries are the most commonly reported ethical issues, and they can be a boundary violation between a client and a staff member, between a staff member and a supervisor, and it might involve having a dual relationship, for example, that your client is also your car mechanic. So where business or personal relationships cross boundaries. So these are some of the many types of ethical dilemmas that you might experience in your internship. So what is our ethical responsibility as practitioners? Practitioners need to practice in a manner that is ethical and legal, and to consider whether their intervention has unintended harmful consequences. To do that, we need a decision-making process that weighs values and obligations, considers consequences of possible actions, and selects the best course of action. So an ethical decision-making process is one that protects the rights of all involved and ensures that our professional duties and responsibilities are addressed. And this requires that we're aware of our own values and morals, of our profession's values, of society's values, our professional ethical codes and guidelines, and then all the legal mandates that influence our decision. Where any of these conflict, we can have an ethical dilemma. And rarely in an ethical dilemma is there one right answer, but there's possibly a best or better answer or decision. And why is this so important? Well, one unintended consequence of unresolved conflicts and unresolved ethical dilemmas is practitioner burnout. This harms the practitioner, clients, and the organization. And it takes time and practice and experience to become skilled at ethical decision making. So this is one way to make use of your internship and your supervisor to learn this important skill that is going to serve you well in your life and your career. So this is the ethical decision-making model we're going to use in this course, and maybe you will continue to use it throughout your life. There's many models, and they're all very similar in terms of how they approach ethical dilemmas. So first, we need to describe the problem or the dilemma that we are facing. Who is involved? What are they dealing with it? Whose issue is it? Why is it a problem? Then we need to clearly articulate what the conflict is. Is it a legal issue? Is it an ethical issue? Is it personal, clinical, or is it a combination? Is it an internal conflict or an external conflict? There's many different questions we need to ask. Then we need to identify the relevant ethics, laws, and our own values that come into play in the situation. We need to consult widely with our supervisor, sometimes with an attorney, with colleagues. And although these steps are all presented from 1 to 6 are presented linearly, you will often go back and forth between them to get a clear picture of the dilemma. We might also rank the issues and rank the guidelines and laws and values that apply. From this examination and consultation, we then will generate a list of alternative actions and then examine each carefully to determine what the benefits and consequences of are each, both short-term and long-term. We need to consider the impact of our decision on the individual client and then the broader impact that it might have. In the next slide, we're going to discuss some factors that weigh in considering the best course of action. Once you have picked the course of action, you need to plan out how you're going to implement it. And then once it's been implemented, you need to evaluate its effectiveness. What did you learn? Were the results as you expected, or were there unexpected results? Do you still think it was the best decision? And what are the implications of that for your future ethical decision making? So here are some things to consider regarding action. And these are similar to the ethical principles screen in your Kaiser book. The main message is you need assistance in deciding on the best course of action in an ethical dilemma. So the highest obligation that we have as human beings and as human service professionals is protecting human life. But how you define that can be in itself a dilemma. And it's also not just about protecting life itself, but the quality of life needs to be considered. People should be treated equally, but should also have particular care taken based on unequal status. So, for example, a child or a disabled person. People have the right to make their own decisions. That's what we mean by autonomy and empowerment, and should be empowered to do so. And then we need to think about what would happen if our decision was made public. Could we justify it or explain it, and would it still be acceptable? We also have to eliminate alternatives in our decision-making process that have no resources or support. So let's look at a couple of different scenarios and see how we would go through making a decision. So this first one, how would I respond if I meet a client on the street with whom I've been working or have been or am currently working? If I greet the client, I may be violating confidentiality. If I don't, he or she may feel ignored. What about when I'm with other people? If someone greets me and I say hello and then my family asks, how do you know this person? So this is actually quite a common situation for the helping professionals. So it's particularly common if you live in a small town, but it also happens in Seattle. I often run into clients or former clients in Seattle. So it's awkward. The confidentiality is awkward for both the client and the helper because you have to be careful not to violate the client's confidentiality, to inform people that this client is having services of some kind. So I think the main thing to keep in mind is that you're letting the client control the situation. You're waiting to see if the client greets you. If the client introduces you, you do not ever make the first move. As I said, it's likelier in small communities where you might go to church with a client or live in the same neighborhood, or your children might go to the same school as a client's child. But I've had it happen to me riding the bus in Seattle or just walking down the street. And then you may actually be out and about and see a client doing something they shouldn't be doing, like a recovery client out drinking, or a client in a domestic violence shelter meeting with their abuser. And this is a situation where you do not have time to follow the ethical decision-making process. You're right there in the middle of it. So it is useful for you to plan out this type of situation in advance. In some settings where the likelihood of running into a client is large, or if you know you and the client move in similar circles, you should plan and talk about this with the client in advance. You should say to the client, how would you like me to handle it if we run into each other in public? What would you like to do? Should I greet you? Should I not? Would you want to greet me? Should we just pretend we don't know each other? So these are things that you should work out in advance with clients. So this is a scenario that happens frequently where you have to think on your feet, where you don't have time to go through the ethical decision-making process that we talked about. And you should think about these sort of things out in advance. But now we're going to look at a scenario where you do have time, where you are working in a domestic violence shelter, Anne is, and in the support group session that she is leading, Rachel, a client, admits to hitting her 2-year-old daughter 1 month ago. Anne knows that professionals are legally obligated to report child abuse. She raises the issue at a staff meeting the next day. Anne's supervisor and another counselor are against reporting Rachel to CPS. They feel like doing so will cause Rachel to leave the shelter, return to her abuser, and put herself and daughter in greater harm. Having an open CPS case will also threaten Rachel's custody of her daughter and her case against her abuser. They feel that they can work with Rachel better on her parenting issues if she stays at the shelter. So this is a complicated situation, and we're going to pick it apart step by step using the ethical decision-making process. So let's go step by step through the decision-making model. So in this scenario, what is the problem or the dilemma? Who is involved? What are they dealing with? Whose issue is it? Why is it a problem? And I'm going to say that I think it's a problem of the conflict between wanting to protect the child and then also the worker's obligation and the agent's obligation to report child abuse versus the client's rights and empowerment and the confidentiality issues of a support group. So these are some of the dilemmas. And then maybe also the fact that you might not believe that CPS is the most effective agency for helping your client with the problem. So some of the issues and conflicts involved are, was the client informed of the limits of confidentiality when she came to the shelter and started attending the group? Did she know that if she revealed something like what she revealed, what the consequences would be? Would it be more harmful to the client to report her and risk her losing custody and returning to her abuser? So what is the level of harm that we're talking about here? What are your and the shelter workers' beliefs about how helpful CPS and that system is to clients? What are your and the shelter's legal obligations? And what is your particular role and legal obligation as an intern? And then what constitutes abuse? What exactly did Rachel do? How much danger is the child in? And if we look back at that list of priorities of what we look at when we're considering a decision, we know that life and quality of life and harm are kind of really high up on the list. And so we really need to think of the interests of the child. So then after you kind of laid out what all the issues are, you need to kind of consult what the relevant ethical guidelines are. In this case, we're going to look at the National Organization of Human Services Code of Ethics. Though if we looked at the Social Work Code of Ethics or the Mental Health Counselor Code of Ethics, we would find similar things. So one standard in the Code of Ethics is that human service professionals protect the client's right to privacy and confidentiality, except when such confidentiality would cause serious harm to the client or others. So here we see that this is exactly the crux of the issue, that we're supposed to protect the client's confidentiality, but we need to assure that there is no harm before we do that. And then standard 4, if you suspect that danger or harm has occurred, it's your responsibility to act in an appropriate professional manner to protect the safety of the individuals. This may be seeking consultation, supervision, or breaking the confidentiality. And then the other standard is related to seeking appropriate consultation. So these are some of the ethical guidelines that are going to be guiding us. Now, what does the law say that is also going to need to guide us? So we can look at the Washington State Code and look at, first of all, how does Washington State define child abuse and neglect? And we need to really look closely at that. It does not include physical discipline of a child. We need to determine if what the client did was physical discipline or if it was abuse. And then who is required to report child abuse and neglect? And we see a list of all the service providers who are. So you're also going to be considering your own values because, of course, they do play a role and they're often what causes the dilemma. So your beliefs about child protection, about child rearing, about CPS, your beliefs about women who are abused, your feelings about how your being an intern might impact your role in the situation and what your obligations are. And then you need to obtain consultation. You should talk to your internship supervisor, to colleagues at the shelter, as well as your professor. And then in this process, it was decided that more information is needed. So what does the law say exactly about abuse? What is required to be reported exactly? What happened in detail? Did the child get a spanking? Was she injured? Is this a pattern? If the agency has an attorney, that person should also be consulted. So then you're going to generate and examine alternative actions to brainstorm some alternatives. And at the brainstorming phase, you're just listing all the possible things you could do and not really like evaluating them to make sure they're the ones yet. You're going to go back and look at this list again and then come up with the best course of action. So here's a few of the alternatives you might come up with. You're going to gather more information, and then after you have this information, have an informal conversation with someone at CPS. Have a hypothetical conversation. And this is really more of a step 6. It's really more about obtaining consultation. And after you've had that consultation, you can then decide what to do. You may feel like you just need to report the situation to CPS after discussing it with the client. So it is important to tell the client that you're going to do that and why. And the consequences are, well, the positive consequences is the child is protected. The negative consequences are Rachel could lose custody or lose the case against her abuser, and might result in her returning to him and putting everyone in greater harm's way. It might also result in the other clients feeling alienated if they find out about this. They might feel like they might not be able to talk freely in group. So there are some consequences to this course of action. You may decide not to report the situation, but to discuss it thoroughly with Rachel and require her to take parenting classes. Possible consequences: the child could be in danger. The reputation of the agency might suffer, especially with the authorities. Rachel might leave the shelter because she's not like being told what to do, which would again put the child in potential danger. So these are just some of the examples of alternatives you would generate. And then after going through all those and weighing the positives and the consequences of each alternative, then you're going to make a decision and plan your course of action. So in this case, here's what the counselor or the intern decided. I will talk with the client and explore more deeply what happened and then determine how that fits into the legal and ethical requirements. Then I will consult with my supervisor, the shelter attorney, and CPS. If all agree, I will report the situation. No matter what happens, Anne still needs parenting education support. She also needs to learn about the cycle of violence and its impact on children. I should continue to support Anne and her child, and also make sure that the agency policy on informed consent in groups is in place and that I use it. And then after you have done what you've decided to do, and however that comes out, you need to evaluate that. Are the goals for the client and her child met? Is the child safe? Are client rights protected? You need to sort of evaluate all the different things to see if that course of action was effective in meeting your goals and the client's goals. And so, again, you want to go back to this ethical principle screen to test your choice. As we said, the highest obligation is protecting human rights. So you want to do everything to ensure, or protecting human life, I'm sorry. You want to do everything to ensure that that child is safe. And at the same time, looking at the rights and welfare of the client. Would you do the same thing with others in similar situations? Would you approve of whatever you did if a colleague did it? Are you supporting the client autonomy as much as possible? One alternative we didn't discuss is you could have the client herself call CPS and talk through the situation. If someone found out about how you handle a problem, would you be able to explain that to the public and that be acceptable? Is it fair the way you're treating this client? Are you causing the least possible harm, etc.? So all these things you want to look at as you're evaluating the choice that you made. So this is just an example of how you might go through the ethical dilemma, ethical decision-making process with a client situation. And I just want to remind you that this week you have a self-assessment of your own ethical and professional beliefs. There's a question on the discussion board related to that. And that the self-assessment I want you to hold on to through next quarter, because we're going to take it again to see if things changed between your first quarter, the beginning of your first quarter of internship and the end of your internship. And don't forget to answer the other questions on the discussion board too. And just to say, you are just beginning your lifelong journey in developing ethical competence, and we will be having many rich discussions related to this throughout the quarter.